muy contentos de que nos hayan invitado y no podíamos dejar de estar aquí. Muchas gracias, Alfred.
Muy bien. No, muchas gracias a ustedes, ¿no? Para participar a esta hora, ¿no? En este evento muy importante, ¿no? Es un evento clave para la red, yo creo.
Por eso mismo queríamos estar aquí en persona.
Muy bien, muy bien. Estoy muy contento. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ustedes, Alfred.
Hasta pronto.
Les deseo mucho éxito en el evento. Sé que va a ser así.
Gracias. Pero muchas manos han trabajado fuertemente para tener un éxito, ¿no? Con este evento. Entonces vamos a ver, tenemos un commitment increíble de la parte de Luxembourg. Es fantástico.
Qué bueno, me alegro mucho.
Muy bien, entonces, hasta pronto, ya, gracias. Susana.
I do not hear and I do not see anybody. Is the conference still on?
starne darauf, mehr ist die Leute helfen, die Video. Da mal jetzt gucken, was das Problem ist, wenn etwas ähnlich blockiert wird.
are both very pleased. As the finance minister in charge also of the promotion of the financial center, I can see in your decision a recognition of the importance of our financial center, which has recently been ranked #1 in the European Union, and which is also very well known as a sustainable financial center. And I think Minister Fayot, who will speak after me as a minister in charge of public development aid, is also thrilled that you have chosen Luxembourg, because for us, inclusiveness in the field of finance is key, and as a country that devotes more than 1% of its GDP to development aid, I think this is really a good sign. And I would also like to say that all the stakeholders in Luxembourg are very pleased about your decision, and they will all work hand in hand with you. I think of the regulators, the European Central Bank, and the CSSF, which does the supervision, as well as the Commissariat aux Assurances, but I also think of the university, who is already a very strong partner for you. I think of the Luxembourg House of Financial Technologies, or I think of ADA, which is specialized in microfinances, and I could list even more initiatives and players that are keen to continue to work with you and even boost that cooperation. Normally, we would have done that here with hundreds of people if there were not the COVID, the pandemic. Now, we speak here from Kirchberg, where a year ago, Luxembourg hosted the 4th annual meeting of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, where we received more than 1,000 participants. Yes, we have to do it remote. Let's accept that. Let's also live with that virus and try to draw the lessons that the virus is teaching us. Where is Europe in all of this? Well, I must say in the beginning, the answer was slow, but since April, I must say that Europe has lived up to the challenge of this virus. As a finance minister, I participated to the different Eurogroup meetings in inclusive format, as this was called, which means that all the countries were represented, and we had a three-pronged backstop approach worth 540 billion euros, and already mentioned the principle of a resilience and recovery fund, which then in July was agreed by the prime ministers. This is an act of solidarity that in that scope, Europe has not known in the past, and we have mobilized 750 billion for this recovery fund. But next to the EU institutions and the European countries, let's face it that the European Central Bank also played a major role by having a very dynamic policy with negative interest rates and also buying of assets that has helped stabilize the economies. Now, what lessons should we learn from the COVID crisis, which obviously has an impact on what the Alliance for Inclusive Finance does, which means more solidarity, being closer to others? How can we organize sustainable growth? Well, I think there's three things that are obvious. We will have less conferences and more webinars as we do today. We will have less traveling and more home working or distant work. And we will have less traditional industry and trade and more e-commerce. And what does that mean? Well, it means that mobile and digital technology are key. So we need to revisit what we do all in that area. And I think this goes also for the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Today in the afternoon, I will have a Eurogroup meeting, and tomorrow an ECOFIN, where we're going to talk about these issues, about the challenges of digitalization and of e-commerce. And I would like to highlight 3 that we're going to discuss. We're in the early stages, but we want to finalize this by the next couple of months at EU level. Well, we need to make sure that our EU single market is adapted to this new economy and to the challenges of the pandemic, number 1. 2, we must ensure that we can innovate in this new framework. And 3, we must also make sure that the landscape in the field of taxation is adapted to the new economy, a huge program. Now, this being said, today we're in Luxembourg. I can promise you as a finance minister, as a government, together with my colleague, Franz Fayot, that we're going to continue to work wholeheartedly with AFI in the future. I would like to have one very simple message. You can count on us. Welcome to Luxembourg. Welcome in Luxembourg.
Thank you very much, Minister Gremegna. Let me now hand over to Minister Fayot in his capacity as Minister of Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs of Luxembourg.
Thank you very much. Good morning, dear listeners. Special hello to Alfred, Hannig, and warm welcome to Ilya and his team, which there is 1 member so far, but I understand there will be more in the near future. So welcome to Luxembourg. It's a pleasure to be here this morning on the occasion of the launch of AFI's first representation office in Europe. We are proud to host you here in Kirchberg this morning, the heart of the Luxembourg Financial and also European Center. Creating positive social impact, social and environmental impact through closer cooperation with the financial sector is at the core of Luxembourg's development strategy. We have recognized decades ago, I would say, that we can leverage on this asset that is this financial center here in Luxembourg, and we can put it to use not only for commercial purposes, but also to boost the financial inclusion, also to boost social and environmental goals. We have a very ambitious green finance agenda, but we also have an ambitious financial inclusion agenda. And to that end, AFI's, the launch of AFI's office here today is another piece to the puzzle and another brick to building the ecosystem that we need in that respect. The presence of AFI will enrich our system of ecosystem for inclusive finance, promote true impact, and thereby also stronger contribution again to the financial sector to the sustainable development goals. AFI already works with all the members of the financial inclusion ecosystem, as I could testify to on Friday when I visited the House of Microfinance here in Luxembourg. We had a very productive and rich roundtable with all the members of this community, ADA, the microinsurance people, the networks, and all of them already know Ilya, who has in a very short period of time been able to integrate that ecosystem. So there is much positive feedback already, and I think everybody is excited to further work on building up this relationship. So far, cooperation with AFI has been a little bit difficult, not because there was no willingness to work together, but simply because of the distance that separates Luxembourg from Kuala Lumpur. While we regularly got the chance to witness firsthand the high quality of the discussions of the alliance, as well as the commitment and engagement for positive change that the regulators are bringing to the table, we have really strengthened our exchanges in recent years. One key actor in this regard has been the University of Luxembourg, which conducts internationally recognized research on inclusive finance regulation. Because we have observed the continuous increase in quality, relevance, and interest in their academic work, as well as the uptake of the results of the ADA chair, we have recently decided to extend its scale to its scale and duration also through a new memorandum of understanding between my directorate, the University of Luxembourg, and ADA. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Dirk Zetsche, who is here with us this morning personally, for his continued engagement in making this happen. I would like also to stress the good cooperation with ADA, the university, as well as the EIB and its institute in the framework of the Certificate in Law and Regulation for Inclusive Finance, which AFI has been sponsoring over the last years and in which some of today's participants have already been involved. Dear listeners, we much appreciate the genuine interest of the Alliance for Financial Inclusion in becoming part of the local inclusive finance ecosystem and use this truly international city of Luxembourg as a home base and as a hub to reach out to members and other partners in Europe and beyond, as do most of the organizations that are based here. The Luxembourg government has been proactive in supporting the development of microfinance and inclusive finance since the early 1990s. And again, the presence of AFI can be seen as the culmination of this effort here in Luxembourg and confirms its relevance for the sector. Our experience has shown that inclusive, relevant, and responsible financial services represent efficient means of promoting economic development and eradicating poverty, which are the ultimate goals of our development cooperation. However, such services could not be in place without adequate regulation. Indeed, there is no sustainable impact without a stable environment and the promotion of social well-being through policies and regulation. We are convinced that we can mutually learn from the lessons and best practices of inclusive finance regulation, which AFI has worked on and implemented over the past years in the financial inclusion sector. Cooperation, for which I am in charge, means exchange. It's not about lecturing other countries about how to govern. On regulation, on the opposite, no one has thus far found the silver bullet of regulation. Cooperation means exchange of knowledge, expertise, and best practices, of which Luxembourg has a lot to offer, but no doubt also still a lot to learn. In that sense, engaging with the broader regulation community in Luxembourg and in Europe is crucial to promote truly responsible and sustainable inclusive finance, and at the end of the day, to allow financially excluded populations around the world to seek new opportunities and fulfill their potential. Relevant, adequate, and intelligent regulatory norms of the inclusive finance sector are recognized as being essential for creating value for the customers. Microfinance deserves prudential norms different from those suitable for commercial banks and consumer finance. The important question is not if to regulate, but how to regulate. In that sense, we look forward to an even closer relationship with AFI and its members over the years to come, and a fruitful partnership with all of you. Let us all wish AFI a welcome to Luxembourg. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister Fayot. It is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Alfred Hannig, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Dr. Hannig faces challenges to come to Luxembourg due to COVID-19 measures and will speak to us by digital means. Dr. Hannig, please.
Yes, in a digital time, we are using digital means, and I think we're going to discuss this quite a bit in the coming days. First of all, let me just say that we are very delighted to be in Luxembourg to open the Europe Representation Office of AFI with the generous support from our hosts, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs. Let me first express Minister Gremegna and also Minister Fayot that I really regret that due to the circumstances I can't be with you personally today. But today, with your presence on the ground, we believe that the launch of this office signifies an important milestone in AFI's mission, which is to empower financial policymakers and regulators to increase the access and usage of quality financial services for the unserved and the underserved through the formulation, implementation, and global advocacy of sustainable, inclusive, and gender-sensitive policies. And we also think that the collaboration with Luxembourg's inclusive finance ecosystem and also the broader European community will be an important driver for us in achieving this mission. And I should say, Minister Gremegna, that even before the idea to bring a Europe Representation Office of AFI to Luxembourg, we already have developed a friendly relationship with your government and the Luxembourg Financial Center. I also would like to say that we are very grateful for that. Now, when we look at AFI's journey, it has been an exciting journey over the past 12 years. We have seen a very strong growth of the organization with more and more members joining us. Developed countries have so far not been members, but our base have been the developing countries and emerging economies. And we have really made it to become a leading global organization when it comes to financial inclusion policy and regulation. And that led us in 2016, early 2016, to become an independent organization under Malaysian law. And that is why the head office of AFI is based in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. During this time, I should say that during the past 12 years, AFI members have also credited their engagement in the alliance with the development and implementation of, we have counted over 600 inclusion policy changes that have helped to bring formal financial services to over 650 million previously unbanked and underbanked people worldwide. And in the past years, and I think this is what we also discussed with you along the way, decentralization of our operations and also regionalization have both become an important part of AFI's strategic framework. And this is now more important than ever during a time, and the Minister Gremegna has highlighted already, when traveling becomes more difficult for the time being, engagement becomes more challenging, personal engagement. So we are looking now into a structure also that allows us to stand on more than one leg, and because we believe it is more healthy to stand on maybe 3 or 4 legs, but not only on one leg. And this led us to the opening of the African regional office in Abidjan 2 years ago. We are currently already under implementation of the opening of the office in Costa Rica in San Jose. I must say, our hosts have always shown a very long-standing political and financial commitment to bring AFI into their jurisdictions. We see this, as we see it now in the case of Luxembourg, as an expression of agility, flexibility, and commitment. And I must say this is very true for the Europe office, for both partners, because in less than 2 years, we moved from the mere idea now to the implementation of this office. And those of you who have been in these processes can easily understand how complex such a process is, from an idea to formulating it, conceptualizing it, bringing it to your board, getting the approval, bringing it to the membership, then of course also receiving proposals from interested potential hosts into the evaluation, and finally the negotiations, and now today you are there to hand over the keys. And this happened in less than 2 years, and I think that this is fantastic, and it just shows how serious both sides actually are. Now, as you all know, the AFI Representation Office in Europe will follow a couple of purposes that are very important to drive AFI's mission. First of all, and first and foremost, I should say that from Europe we will work and strengthen our engagement with the AFI members in Europe, Caucasus and Central Asia. But we will also, of course, be able to better entertain our global dialogue, especially between Europe and AFI members in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Arab region, but also in Latin America. The geographical proximity, of course, has some benefits for us. But apart from that, we also want to maintain and even enhance our intellectual partnerships with our funding partners in Europe, like Germany, Sweden, UK, Luxembourg, and France. We want to collaborate more closely with the standard-setting bodies who play an important role in financial inclusion globally. And of course, we also want to shape up the knowledge partnerships with some of the developed country regulators. Now, I should maybe mention that with today's launch of the European Office of AFI, a global financial inclusion policy leadership alliance with close to 100 financial inclusion policy-making and regulatory institutions in 90 developing countries and emerging markets is physically coming now to the developed world. This is an important step for us, and we are super grateful that the government of Luxembourg is a vital partner of AFI in strengthening the linkages between the developed and the developing country policymakers to address issues of shared priority. And these include opportunities and risks of digital financial services, financial inclusion of women, youth, forcibly displaced persons, and other disadvantaged populations. And expanding, of course, green finance through policies that are inclusive and sustainable. And you can see from the enumeration of these priorities that I think both sides agree that no one should be left behind. Now, regarding developed country partnerships, we can already point to examples of developing country cooperation that are already established among AFIs and these institutions. And this includes, for example, the Memorandum of Understanding with the Bank of Portugal to advance financial inclusion in the Lusophone countries. That has been a very successful work stream that has now even expanded beyond Lusophone-speaking members. Then the developing country work stream on converging policy topics that was launched last year in Prague in cooperation with the Bank of the Czech Republic. And finally, I should also mention that there is a fast-growing collaboration with the European Central Bank and other European financial regulatory authorities. For example, Banco de España, Bank of Finland, Bank of Estonia, and also the Bundesbank, plus the Luxembourg regulatory authorities on critical topics such as cybersecurity, digital financial literacy, and consumer protection. Now, given Luxembourg's profound expertise in these and other areas of shared policy interest, it is actually no surprise that following a competitive and very transparent bidding process, AFI has chosen to establish the network's first ever office in Europe in the city of Luxembourg. Dear Minister Gremegna, dear Minister Fayot, I want to take this opportunity to commend the government of Luxembourg for its uniquely innovative, holistic, and inclusive approach to financial sector policy and regulation. And AFI members, I should say, have also put in place innovative policy approaches that are, in many cases, leapfrogging brick and mortar financial infrastructure to embrace and scale digital financial innovation. And this demonstrates indeed the value that can be had from a systemic knowledge exchange between the diverse, inclusive finance communities found among both AFI members and in Luxembourg. And such exchanges will be certainly entertained by this office. We believe that international cooperation is more important today than at any time in the past, not only because the world grapples with the ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we actually see a couple of opportunities, and I think we're going to touch upon these later in the panel discussion. But we also think that at a time when we see growing nationalism and isolationism, it is really now time to show the fertile ground that actually international cooperation can provide for the benefit of all. So this is a very important point for us when we also now move into Luxembourg. Now, given the relevance of technology in the provision of financial services, we will follow the launch ceremony of the AFI office here with a high-level joint learning program that will focus on inclusive fintech ecosystems, cybersecurity, and digital financial services as an enabler of inclusive green finance. And we are hosting the program here together with you in Luxembourg on 6 to 8 October for the heads and deputy heads of AFI member institutions together with the government of Luxembourg. So we're very much looking forward to this. And of course, our long-standing partner, University of Luxembourg, will also be with us. Let me end that just by saying that for us, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, at any time when we actually work with our members on financial inclusion policy and regulatory solutions is key for us. This crisis, of course, comes with a lot of opportunities to take into account those groups that are disproportionately affected from financial exclusion. So we are talking about women, we are talking about younger people, we are talking about even elderly people, we are talking about forcibly displaced persons. And I think it is very important to keep that one always in mind, and I'm very sure that we are very much aligned with our Luxembourg partners when we talk about vulnerable groups and groups that are disproportionately affected. Now, the future of financial inclusion and broader recovery will continue to be shaped by technology, and as the Minister Fayot said, regulators must ensure that new and emerging risks are assessed and managed in a responsible, safe, and sustainable manner. But at the same time, we want to break down the barriers and empower the most vulnerable. Further exclusion for us is not an option. And the crisis is not over yet, and we are on this road together. Now, let me just end by saying that we really thank you for welcoming us so warmly to Luxembourg, where AFI's spirit of innovation, openness, inclusiveness, and unity can continue to thrive and further build peer learning and knowledge-sharing platforms among equal partners, forging close ties and enhancing dialogue between regulators from developing and developing countries. So thank you very much for everything that you have done for us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hannig. We have now time for a couple of questions from the floor, and let me direct maybe the first question directly to Minister Gremegna, because he is to leave, as we heard, for other appointments immediately afterwards. We got a question from the Luxembourg Times, and in a similar way also from the Luxembourg Word. What concrete benefits does the AFI office bring to the Luxembourg Financial Center? And maybe you have also some examples from the fintech space that you want to raise.
Well, thank you. This is a very down-to-earth question to which I would start by saying the obvious. Inclusive finance will make this world a better place and will help us implement the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. I'm wearing that pin on an everyday basis because I really think, and Minister Fayot wears the same pin, really think that we are in this together. And if we want to make the world a better place, inclusive finance is an incredible enabler, is really a way to leapfrog technologies, bring services, financial services, to populations and countries that are deprived of it. So it's a very efficient way to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, close to home, what can we do? Well, we have a lot of know-how in this area, both in digital economy, also in digital infrastructure, because we've been among the pioneers in this area. And second, obviously, with all the players that we have in the financial center, we can really deliver. Now, I think of the fintech community that is gathered in the Luxembourg House of Financial Technologies, but I also think of the investment fund industry. We have more than $5 trillion of assets under management here in Luxembourg. And we know that the investment fund industry is looking for new places to invest. So we can also mobilize a huge amount of money to be channeled to those places and countries that need it. So it is really complementary to what the development aid program of the country does. And that's why I'm pleased to work hand in hand with Minister Fayot on this. So in the end, what we want is a world that is more sustainable, both towards climate change and environment, and also more sustainable, socially speaking, that everybody gets access to essential goods and financial services. So I think this is what Luxembourg can help deliver, and I'm very proud, I must say, that AFI has chosen Luxembourg, because by selecting our country, you demonstrate that our initiatives are taken seriously and matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gramegna. I have a second question from Paper Jam. Maybe it's ideally be answered by Mr. Fayot. What will be the concrete action plan for this year in 2021 that Luxembourg wants to put in place based on AFI's main principles presented this morning?
Well, I would say that the first step really is to get AFI Luxembourg going, really, I would say, in an environment that is not straightforward, where we need to do a lot of teleworking, remote distance contacts. So I think settling in, connecting with the local community of the other members of the ecosystem, and as I said, I think that has already started quite well and will further evolve. But also really get involved in all the things we are doing in Luxembourg, and where there is a regulation aspect at every juncture. I was back in March, we had the Catapult Africa Prize for fintechs, which are active in the development policies. And I think there is, when you look at it, whether it's payment services, insurance, investment funds, there is always a regulation aspect at every juncture. So I think the challenge will be also to get involved in the local tissue, in the local ecosystem, and really bring this added value on reflecting on what kind of regulation really works for these in all of these initiatives. And then I think the program for the next year will obviously also be to continue the work with the EIB, with the University of Luxembourg, all the things that are already up and running and are working quite well. So I'm sure it will be an interesting and a rich year ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. In particular, the challenges of COVID-19 requires a lot of openness to innovation in this regard. And I think in this old setup, we are extremely grateful for the support from all the institutions, from the government, but also, of course, AFI, to make this AFI European Representative Office happen. We have now basically another round of questions, but for that, we also invite real experts in the financial regulatory space. And before they do that, I thank Minister Gremegna and Minister Fayot, who both need to, who have contributed to our session. And Minister Gremegna will leave us now for other commitments. And now we will welcome a number of distinguished speakers who will join our panel now from other parts of the world, but also one part close to here. All of them are at the top of their respective financial supervisory authorities and central banks in their countries. And it is a particular honor to welcome them virtually now to our launch session. Let me introduce them one by one. On the one hand, we will have Mr. Fayot still with us, who will, of course, present the official Luxembourg perspective. Then also Dr. Hannig will stay with us. And then now come our distinguished guests. Let me introduce them by certain order. Let me start with Dr. Madlanyane, Governor of the Central Bank of Lesotho. Dr. Madlanyane is an economist with a PhD, and she is the first female governor in the history of the bank. And as such, we are representing not only inclusiveness in the financial space, but also here gender equality. A second distinguished guest we have is Dr. Hernández Naranjo. She's a superintendent of the Superintendencia de la Economía Popular y Solidaria de Ecuador, which is a financial supervisory and central bank institution at the same time. Dr. Hernández is a lawyer, and as such, she has also spent a part of her academic career in Europe, and so she will probably be well familiar with some of the languages that we speak here in this region. Last but not least, I'm welcoming Mr. Claude Marx. He's a Director General of the Commission de Surveillance du Secteur Financier, CCSSF, our Luxembourg Financial Supervisory Authority. And it's particularly noteworthy for the central bank governors present here that the CSSF is also in charge of supervising credit institutions, payment institutions, the asset management and fund management sector. So it's an integrated financial supervisory authority. And Mr. Marx is also a member of the Board of Supervisors of the European Securities and Market Authorities, one of the three ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities, which are the regulatory backbone of the single European financial markets. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all three here. And maybe I can start with a question for Mr. Fayot because of his commitments after this launch session. Maybe, Mr. Fayot, you've mentioned Luxembourg's proactivity towards the inclusive finance sector. Could you tell us a bit more about the reasons of this long-term engagement and how it fits within the priorities of Luxembourg's development cooperation?
Yes, as I was saying in my opening remarks, Luxembourg has been really pushing and promoting the first microfinance and then inclusive finance, other sectors of other financial services, specifically in the context of its development policy over the last decades. And I think the reason why we did was that it was really the consequence or in the continuity of what we did from the 1980s on when we started our development policy. So it's really a question of, it's about, first of all, education. One of the pillars of our development policy has always been education. And I think the normal consequence of that is empowerment. So I think as a result of education and coming after education and also professional training is empowering people to be economically sustainable. And I think that microfinance, inclusive finance is a very powerful tool in doing that. We have a financial sector which is a strong pillar of our economy. And again, I think it's a logical step to use that financial sector and to use the financial firepower that goes with it to further that agenda and really put it to use for completing the sustainable development goals. One example I can give: I was on Friday at the House of Microfinance, and we launched a new instrument called the Snoop. Which is really a new financing and technical assistance tool which we have built together with the Swiss corporation to assist smallholder farmers. So up to 3 million in a first step and then up to 10 million in a second stage. And I think, again, that's another example of quite a sophisticated tool of financial inclusion that is really helping very concretely to improve people's lives, in this particular case, farmers that are in need of financing. And the same goes obviously for small businesses all over the world in developing countries. So it's really about building up this small and medium business segment, which is the backbone of economies, not only in Europe, but also in developing countries. So I think that's really key, and that is one of the main reasons for doing this. And then, of course, we hope that this presence of AFI here in Luxembourg will further strengthen the existing dialogue between financial regulators in developed and developing countries, because, as I said, regulation is key in all aspects of financial services, not only here, but also in developing countries. And I think, therefore, it's a very exciting opportunity to do this at this time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yes, in particular, given that the economic fallout of the crisis will probably hit the developing and least developed countries particularly hard, I think these programs are in dire need indeed. Could you maybe elaborate on the current tendencies that you identify in inclusive finance and maybe certain opportunities that you can see in this sector?
Yes, I think it's what we see is that we are in a fast changing landscape. We have been in Europe in a fast changing landscape, and Claude Marx will be much better positioned than me to talk about this. But of course, since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we have seen major step up in regulation, and also I think in the quality of regulation of banks, but also generally of financial service providers. And this has also changed, I think, the philosophy towards regulation, which was for a very long time perceived as mainly a cost factor and a bit of an annoyance, and which has gradually evolved to be seen as a factor of quality. I think nowadays in developed economies, as in Luxembourg, I think good regulation is seen as key to a quality warrant, really, to be perceived as someone who is providing high quality services. And I think the same trend will be there also in inclusive finance. Apart from that, I think the main trends we see is that, first of all, the crucial role of women and youth in the transition towards a more equitable and sustainable future, and also with a view to provide them with opportunities to fulfill their potential. Secondly, of course, then there is the factor of climate change, which is ever more present. That's why we need to further boost financial services for underserved smallholder farmers who have shown considerable resilience also during the sanitary crisis, and which are really needed also to allow them to strengthen climate resilience and environmentally friendly practices. Thirdly, digitalization is of course key. That's also something that we are working on very, very much here in Luxembourg. We have a number of initiatives where we work hand in hand with our fintech sector to bring these services to developing countries in order to allow rural populations to access to public and private services, reduce costs, or also simply help them to access education or the labor market.
Thank you very much. You have kindly accepted to participate also in the upcoming joint learning program later this week in your role as Minister of the Economy. Can you tell us what your expectations for these 3 days of exchanges are?
Well, I think many of the challenges and the trends that were just mentioned will certainly be covered by the joint learning program. There are a number of, I think, key points that I think will be in the center of the discussions in the coming 3 days. First of all, digital financial services and how innovations in financial technology can help us to seek the opportunities of this fast-paced change. Second point is cybersecurity, which is of course also central in the current context of rapid digitalization. If we want to ensure that we do not harm clients of the inclusive finance sector and want to also protect our financial sectors as a whole. And then once again, climate change and how inclusive finance will need to make adjustment to guarantee a sustainable and environmentally friendly development. Once again, climate action and financial sector policy making nexus will become ever more important in the next years. I think in all of these sectors, participants to the next few days will find the diversity of experts, independence. I looked at the program, which is very promising. So I think you're all looking at a very rich and constructive discussion over the next 3 days.
Thank you very much. Minister Fayot, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to ask our distinguished panelists a number of questions also regarding the current policy challenges, not only COVID-19, but of course also the topics of joint learning program regarding digitalization and sustainability. And in this regard, may I direct the first question to Dr. Hannig. What are the policy action and learnings that are emerging from AFI's member jurisdictions during the past month as your members work to strengthen the resilience of their respective economy?
Yeah, Dirk, thank you very much, and thank you, of course, for the question. Now, I think I should say that before we talk about the lessons, we should maybe also mention that our members have been extremely active, even before the lockdowns have taken place in most of the places, to collect their very early experience, and of course also to make this available through the platform. And I think when you look at the website and some of the virtual channels, you will actually find the AFI dashboard that is a very up-to-date collection of policy responses, immediate policy responses that our members have put in place in order to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think we have been very active at a very early stage. And what actually turned out for us to be some of the main challenges is indeed that we found that in many countries there was an observed lack of interoperability. We also lack of interoperability or partial interoperability, which actually relates to the limitation to deploy extensive and effective DFS solutions, for instance, for cash transfer programs and others. So this was one point I wanted to mention on the supply side, but also on the demand side. We saw quite a couple of issues like low financial literacy, low levels of digital literacy. We also, in some countries, as we know, when it comes to the enhanced usage of digital financial services, the lack of national ID can be a major barrier. So actually, all these challenges around digital financial services delivery came to the surface, and indeed, the members found very, very fruitful and effective ways to deal with these challenges. And we have actually seen the policy responses to be categorized in two main buckets. So the first bucket is all around the immediate interventions. So members devised policy changes that targeted to address the immediate impact of the pandemic on the economy. And you're all aware that, like in many developed countries as well, members addressed macroeconomic and financial stability aspects. Several stimulus packages were brought underway with the objective to enhance liquidity, and also moratoriums in the financial sectors were instituted. But then, coming back to the digital financial services delivery challenges, members also implemented reforms to digital financial services regulations. For example, the greater use of eKYC and digital identities, and reduced transaction fees to ensure that those vulnerable groups who have been hit hard by the crisis could actually receive social transfers from governments, and that businesses could continue to transact digitally. And many countries also designated mobile money agents as so-called essential services that could continue to operate even in the context of national lockdowns. Now, the second bucket refers to the intermediate interventions, where we also are now starting to collect the early experience. Members are currently working on recovery measures to build resilience and to rebuild resilience in their economies. While the lessons from the immediate responses are still relevant, now other factors that require policy interventions are coming into the center here. And these include the facilitation of domestic demand and supply flows, supporting SME sector through credit guarantees and restructuring, and also incentivizing banks to continue lending to SMEs and the real economy. For example, by adjusting capital buffers, enhancing again the use of DFS and fintech platforms, strengthening the demand side, consumer protection and digital literacy, and also enhancing proportionate KYC, which again includes e-KYC measures to sustain the onboarding of new users of DFS products. And of course, taking these steps, we also want to ensure that the response to the crisis is gender sensitive. That means that support is reaching out to women who are working in the informal sector. And we are also looking at the contributions to a green recovery from the crisis, for example, by considering environmental assessment in the allocation of fiscal stimulus funds and collaborating with the private sector as well as other members of the network. So all this, I think, should give a very rough picture on what is going on in the network. And I think coming back to the earlier questions, even these very interesting experience from AFI members are definitely a very interesting food for thought, even for, I think, developed country regulators who are basically also struggling in the aftermath of this health crisis. And I think coming to Luxembourg, of course, will give us numerous opportunities to exchange further on this knowledge and provide such cutting-edge knowledge to other regulators. Thank you, Dirk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hannig. Maybe we change now the perspective from the AFI members countries to Luxembourg as a host jurisdiction. And with Mr. Marx, we have not only a distinguished supervisor, but also a very experienced lawyer with us. And so maybe the question that is inherently legal, but also has a lot of things to do with the supervisory practice. How does the CSSF meet the challenge to square the circle with regard to achieving a balance between the openness to innovation, investor protection, and financial stability?
Yes, good morning, everybody. I think that the framework here has already been well laid down by Minister Gremegna and Minister Fayot. And I think this is exactly the issue that you touch upon here. On the one hand, we have to be proactive, and we have to have a flexible approach. We should not unnecessarily hinder innovation through red tape. On the other hand, we have as our mission the safety and the protection of the financial center. We have to contribute as part of our mission to the financial stability. And also we have another very important mission, which is consumer protection, investor protection. We have to make sure there is market confidence. And also we have to make sure that financial innovation is not being abused, for instance, for financial crime, for money laundering. And so what we see here is that very often new technologies and new instruments carry very classical risks, which then we have to take into account. I think the integration of technology in our work is a continuous challenge. And the way we approach this is to be technologically neutral. And what that means is that when we grant an authorization, we will grant it on the basis of the services that will effectively be rendered, regardless of the technology that is being used. And we look at this on a risk-based approach to assess the way that technology is implemented. What we have to do, though, is we have to make known what is our approach to new technologies. And the way we do that is through publishing a certain number of documents. And they can be very different depending on the subject matter. They can be a CSSF regulation, which is mandatory. They can also be a circular letter, which is explanatory of the regulation. But it can be also a frequently asked questions that is updated on a regular basis as technology evolves. A good example for this would be the account opening process through digital means. And it can also be a piece of research, as we did by publishing white books. So there are various examples here. I think what we have done a few years ago is that we have set up an innovation hub, and that is a dedicated point of contact. And through that innovation hub, we are in permanent contact with the market. We are always available to meet with the market, to learn about new technologies, and then to guide on how we see the mitigation of the risk associated with the new technology. We are also always open to consultation.
Thank you very much. Of course, the Innovation Hub is today something that among AFI members is widely discussed. It may be interesting to note that according to my research, with the year 2014, the Innovation Hub was basically an invention of the Luxembourg CSSF. So Mr. Marx was too basically kind not to mention that in this regard, the CSSF was at the forefront of the legal developments. May I also go to one of the leaders in this field, to Dr. Hernandez of Ecuador. She is up there very early on because you know that Ecuador is several hours behind Luxembourg. And Dr. Hernandez, may I ask you, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected Ecuador's economy, in particular the unbanked and underbanked parts of it? And what steps is the Superintendencia undertaking to build economic resilience and support economic recovery?
Thank you very much. As we know, COVID-19 affects everyone, regardless of the age. It is evident in increased unemployment caused by the closing of companies and business. Furthermore, the increase of unemployment in the country has generated a growth of street and informal commerce due to the need to generate an income. The COVID-19 crisis has generated a disruption in economic and social dynamics in Ecuador, increasing the gap that was already existed. The risks are high for the micro-entrepreneurial women and the business segment, as well as the informal sector because of income generation reduction by social confinement measures. The parts in Ecuador that have especially in certain geographical areas, such as the provinces with the largest population in the country, and in certain economic sectors like transportations, commerce, tourism, and services. The main effects of the unbanked, underbanked, and vulnerable groups, particularly of women, are low liquidity, business closing, small companies paralyzed or operating at levels below the installed capacity, reduction of workforce, and growth of the informal markets. So in this point, we have to make a real big effort of supervision because we need that the system work well to help the people to maintain the transition and recovery measures. We are monitoring the entities each day. We have a sensitive analysis of the sector to find the most sensitive groups. And we find the way to help the people in an extraordinary deferral of credit obligations. And this measure help not only the people, so the credit unions too. So in these temporary regulations, we allow that the entities may modify the conditions of the credits, maintaining the rating of the credit at not modifying the requirement of corresponding provision. This measure until today has benefited 60% of the credit union debtors. All these reforms are temporary measures to alleviate certain regulatory requirements to the entities, but we do this because we know if the entities are good, the people who have their money and credits with the entities can have a better chance too.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. Dr. Matlagnane, could you give us a description of how COVID-19 affected Levoso and what are the measures that the central bank is undertaking to mitigate the impact?
Well, thank you very much. Let me also congratulate Luxembourg for hosting the AFI representative office in Europe, and as well congratulate AFI for yet another office in another region for us to collaborate with. Now, let me start by saying that Lesotho is the last country on the African continent to register positive or a positive case in COVID. in other regions, like in other regions, the cases are now increasing. But even before we registered a positive case, given the openness and the size of the economy, it became apparent to us that we, as early as March, were already experiencing supply chain disruptions. And as a result of that, some industries have had to close even before we register some positive cases. So supply chain disruptions were one such, and of course, the SMME sector was affected at the time when we had lockdowns. And this is the most vulnerable of the society that we have. Now, on top of that, Lesotho is a country that relies a lot on remittances. And because of the closures and lockdowns in other regions, we experienced a decrease, a large or huge decreases in remittances and therefore national output. And of course, this again led to joblessness as well as destitution among the vulnerable sections of society. And of course, this translates to reduced resource mobilization for government, impacts on taxation, and other things. So we have experienced a downward trend in economic activity in general, but more importantly, the most vulnerable sectors of the society have been affected. As a central bank, as you can imagine, central banks were the first to respond globally. And of course, we were not an exception in that response. For us, running a fixed exchange rate and therefore maintaining a peg with the South African rand, COVID came at a time when most of the African countries, Lesotho inclusive, have been experiencing lower revenues, lower levels of reserves, increasing debt, and increasing deficits, as well as lower prices of minerals and exports. So for us, the first thing that we had to do was to look into how we stabilize the macroeconomy. And among other things, this has been to look into having an adequate level of reserves so that we can maintain the peg. But more importantly, in order to, for two reasons, one, to protect the society, but also to try to balance the economy, one of the things that we did was to reduce rates. Monetary easing has been the policy that most of the central banks have applied. And for us, this was since March this year, we reduced rates by 275 basis points as a way of stimulating the economy, but also as a way of protecting the population. But of course, this has to be balanced very well and carefully with the mandate of maintaining financial stability. We want to also maintain financial stability by seeing that the financial firms are also protected in a way. So one of the things that we did as a way of seeing that economic activity continues at some level, at some reasonable level, was to negotiate with the mobile network operators and negotiate with operators of platforms that use fintech to reduce transaction fees so that the population can then be able to transact even during lockdowns. And of course, this helped a lot in terms of maintaining the resilience of the households and firms. But at the same time, we also looked into raising the prudential limits on transacting on these platforms. And we have seen quite an improvement in the on-take of fintech, while at the same time we're also trying to be as pragmatic as possible in order to maintain financial stability, even as we protect the population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madlañane. I have another set of questions for each of you, and I would kindly ask for a short answer in the interest of letting also the audience ask a number of questions. So maybe I can just stay with you. I know that the topic is very dear to you, which is gender inclusive finance, and now we're moving away from crisis management to a more sustainable approach here. In this regard, in which regard is there potential in emerging digital technology to advance financial inclusion when it comes to gender inclusive finance? Dr. Madlañane?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So when it comes to gender inclusive finance, the Central Bank of Lesotho is one of the institutions that is very committed to digitalization for the sake of improving and sustainable growth, but more importantly for youth and women inclusion in the economy. For a number of years, we have ventured and we have worked on our strategy to see that women are more included, and youth as well, in order to address issues concerning youth unemployment. I must point out that as much as we were kind of late takers on platforms like mobile money or cell phone banking, which we started in 2013, according to the Findex 2017, what we have managed over time is to reduce or reverse the imbalance so that more women are now included as opposed to about 5-6 years ago. So we find that with the advent of fintech and mobile platforms to help us with women who are mostly in SMEs and mostly are heading households, we find that women have been more included as a result of fintech and our work in collaboration with AFI to try to have vulnerable societies included, either in the formal financial industry or in the informal financial industry. So what we find out that the access to finance has improved, and we find that the gender gap has been reversed, and it is now women are much more advanced. And on top of that, we continue to make room for other initiatives to come on board, so that, as I said, Lesotho is one country that depends on remittances, and of course we are integrated with many countries because we are quite open as an economy. So cross-border transacting is very important for us, and we continue to work on with other countries to see that we harmonize platforms, we harmonize legal frameworks for us to be able to address risks that may come on with fintech, risks that may arise from legal frameworks that are not harmonized, for example, regulatory arbitrage, and of course, cybersecurity. So we work together with regions and together with AFI to see that we continue with our initiative to adopt and improve the on-take of fintech as a mechanism to ensure sustainable growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe this is a good bridge to Mr. Marks. How does the CSSF set the tone at the top to make the whole CSSF organization aware of tech challenges and opportunities? And maybe you can also bring in your own experience how the CSSF uses technologies for its own supervisory purposes.
Yes, well, these topics, fintech topics, are obviously high on the agenda of the whole of the CSSF, because digital agenda is for all the businesses that we supervise high on the agenda. So we have to take care of it, and we do take care of it at also our executive committee. We have set up dedicated resources in terms of financial innovation on the one hand, and then supervision of IT systems on the other hand. So that is one specific action that we have decided many years ago. We also have done a certain number of publications. I alluded already to it before. One example would be a white book that we published on artificial intelligence, where we talk about use cases, and then we talk about risks associated to it, and we make certain key recommendations for people wanting to make use of that technology. We have signed a number of memorandums of understanding that are specifically for the area of fintech, with Australia, for instance, with Dubai. We are participating at a number of fintech conferences as attendees, but also as speakers. For instance, earlier this year, before the lockdown, we participated in the Paris FinTech Forum. We also participated in a Luxembourg big conference, which is the ICT Spring, where we can explain what is our approach here. And then we follow the international developments and we participate in a number of international initiatives. And so as to your question on how we make use of new technologies for our supervisory action, well, digital is clearly part of the plan on how to prepare the CSSF for the future. We have designed a plan which is called CSSF 4.0 with a hint to the next industrial revolution. And there's basically three components to this. There's one process component, so to become lean, to become agile as an organization. There's a people component, so we have to train all our staff and not only the specialists in digital matters, because digital is creeping in everywhere, and we cannot stay with the classical division of line supervision by activity and then technology on the other hand. We have to bridge these two together, and then we need to make sure that resources are balanced adequately. And, this whole topic of digital is related to other topics like sustainable finance. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a comprehensive approach to becoming sustainable as a world, you have, for instance, fostering innovation, which is part of SDG number 9. And so there are these links. We have the EU Green Deal. And in order to be viable in the future, of course, you need to have a viable business plan, which is not easy with the cost of regulation going up and pressure on interest rate margins and pressure on commissions, which are the two main revenue sources. And so you have to have a fit business plan in general, but also only those that are digitally enabled and those that have a sustainable development goal within their business plan will be those that will survive. That is our conviction.
Thank you very much. I also learned when preparing this panel that the Director General of the CSF sometimes sits in pitches of new innovative firms in order to see what innovations are coming up in Luxembourg and how they can be used for financial supervision purposes.
The next one is next Sunday.
Sustainability, and that's a keyword also for Dr. Hernandez, as I learned, in particular when it comes to inclusive green finance. How can we basically combine fintech and inclusive green finance to support the overall policy approach of the Superintendencia?
Thank you so much. Since 2016, Ecuador had been working to define strategies to mitigate the effects of climate change and promote the sustainable development of the country, allowing the inclusion of the most vulnerable sectors in society. Several private banks in Ecuador, under the coordination of the Banks Association, together with CAF and the UN Environmental Financial Initiative and the International Finance Corporations, signed 4 years ago the Sustainable Finance Protocol in Ecuador, which promotes comprehensive economic, social, and environmental development through 3 values: prosperity, innovation, and responsibility. In February 2018, Quito's stock exchange launches a new product, green bonds, in the stock of market. After this launch, the biggest bank in Ecuador issued $215 million of green bonds. This fund obtained of this sale of this long-term obligation will be used to finance credits of environmental projects. The public financial system had provided loans to the vulnerable groups most affected by the effects of climate change. And the Minister of Environmental Strategic Alliance of the Public Financial System developed green initiatives to that promote good environmental practices and clear production process, bring access to special credits for green projects. Now we are working in a national climate financial strategy, a planning instrument with vision and priorities, strategic lines on sources, used enable conditions to access to climate financing to accelerate the mobilization of resources from international, national, public, and private climate financing. This strategy has the support of the German cooperation agencies. Green finance is now a goal for Ecuador and a goal for the institutions that we are controlling. We now know that climate change in the country is an issue that we have to work with, and the Superintendencia considered that the potential contribution of the inclusive green finance to make financial resources available to the agriculture sector and find green projects for the MSMEs are the most prioritized thing now. In these strategies are proposed 3 green areas: the credit unions, AFI technical assistance, and financial inclusion and national strategy. And the Superintendencia collaborate with the regulatory and policy frameworks in the national strategy for financial inclusion to allow promoting the mobilization of resources for climate vulnerable sectors to that lead to reduction of risks and allow identification for products that can be green. We know the potential of inclusive green finance through fintech could grow because according to the Central Bank of Ecuador, 40% of the population access banking services. Fintech can more easily reach these unbanked customers, mainly for suburban areas where people may not use the service of a bank, but they are familiar with the use of a cell phone or the internet. Another trait is the young population who prefer to replace the experience of going off to an office and who seek lower rates of services. According for the numbers in Ecuador, 23% of the country population are millennials, aged between 20 and 36, so they are familiar with the cell phone and internet to use fintech alternatives. That's why we want to work with credit unions and allow them to now find in fintech and financial inclusion a key strategy to get through this crisis from COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez. Dr. Hannig, I may want to give you 2 questions because here are some questions coming up from the floor, which I will pose to you. On the one hand, are there any policy innovations that you've seen across the AFI network that could offer lessons to developed countries? And on the other hand, how are we going to ensure interaction between developed and developing countries, and in particular with emerging economies and maybe also the least developed countries on this planet?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, on the first question, I think that has already been said quite a bit. You know, when we saw the financial crisis happening 2008, 2009, I think it became quite evident that some countries had already made enormous progress in terms of bringing digital financial services to the low-income populations. And I think these were the early game changers, I would call them, like in the countries that you all know, especially in East African countries, but also in the Philippines and other countries. We also saw other innovations like agent banking in South America moving forward. And I think this all happened at a time when no one was actually fully aware of the enormous repercussions of technology and how it would actually, change the financial landscape. I think nowadays it is interesting for developed countries as well to see the journey of these countries, like how they have diversified the offerings, how they have actually taken on board additional opportunities of technology, what technology brings. Like, for example, when we talk about RegTech solutions, which of course could strengthen remote supervision, when we see how financial regulators can participate in the financial technology ecosystems more effectively. And then, of course, the early experiences that we see from countries such as Ghana when it comes to bringing actually these services to people who have been additionally excluded by the COVID-19 pandemic. But I would say that it is very important to understand, and this is what I wanted to make earlier actually, that the pandemic as such, the health crisis, could actually be transformative for social and financial inclusion. We call it the COVID-19 factor, actually a factor that actually can become a game changer for social and financial inclusion. And we have talked about digital, we've talked about green, we've talked about gender, and so forth. On the collaboration with the developed countries, let me say that we have already started very concrete activities. I mentioned already a few during the opening remarks. But basically, the framework that we are using here is the Sochi Accord, which is a commitment by the AFI members that was actually launched at the Global Policy Forum in Russia 2 years ago. And this Sochi Accord actually asks for a balanced dialogue among developed country and developing country regulators to drive further financial inclusion, what we call inclusive fintech. And I think we have already seen a couple of concrete activities here, not only the Prague event last year, but also now additional joint learning programs and capacity building events. And this will continue to move forward. And we actually see quite some opportunities in Luxembourg as well to engage with developed countries and actually use the Luxembourg base that we have now also as a hub to engage with some of the developed country regulators, actually to drive further digital financial inclusion.
Thank you very much. Dr. Madlagnane, following up with Dr. Hannig's last words, basically systemic peer learning is the AFI approach. In this regard, it can add knowledge value on many levels. And how does you view such cooperation and how have you experienced it? And maybe you can also give us one example from your day-to-day practice.
Well, thank you once more. Peer learning is one of the flagship approaches of AFI that has been quite and tremendously useful to us and to regulators and jurisdictions, in that through peer learning, we're able to work with other jurisdictions, other regulators, other institutions that have more knowledge than us, or may have knowledge in other areas that we have not yet ventured into, but are looking into venture into. And more importantly, what we have seen is that through peer learning, we are able now to collaborate and partner with either service providers or regulators across jurisdictions and compare notes and be able to provide services in a much more efficient way, whether it's on the regulatory space we are better able to compare notes and be more efficient in what we do. Right now, the Central Bank of Lesotho is doing peer learning with the Central Bank of Armenia, as well as the Bank of Zambia. And in that regard, we are focusing on consumer protection, on financial literacy, as well as financial inclusion policies that will help us to cover some mileage as regards those three aspects. And we find this quite useful in that these are countries where a lot of progress has been made. They have done this before, and we find there are similarities between us, and therefore it's easier to adopt some of the methodologies that they have adopted. Now, we also find that the regulatory authorities and service providers collaborate on other things as well. We find that we are better able to harmonize regulatory frameworks at a cross-border level for us to be able to avoid regulatory arbitrage for common service providers. And therefore, that coordination and cooperation helps us in a way that it's unprecedented. Otherwise, and also very efficient, because otherwise we would have to go on and do research ourselves. So we find standardized reporting helps with issues concerning, for example, standardized reporting, standardized mechanisms, technology, regulatory approaches help a lot with implementation of issues such as eKYC that help us to deal with anti-money laundering and make our technologies and service provisions much safer. On the regulatory space, what I find much more interesting is also that with fintech comes the need for regulatory technology as well as supervisory technology. So collaborating with other technologies through peer learning also help us to see with other authorities through peer learning also helps us to be able to adopt common technologies that will help us to do cooperative supervision. So it's quite efficient, but more importantly, with what we have seen, as Alfred said, Mr. Hannig said, COVID has actually catalyzed the adoption of fintech in a way that has provided us with an efficient way of adopting it, and cashless transacting and safer methods, as well as efficiency in the way that we do things. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up, so I have to interrupt here with this very interesting discussion. Let me just take home 4 points that I take from the discussion. On the one hand, fintech is on the one hand a challenge, on the other hand an opportunity, and it requires regulatory learning. So learning becomes essential. Learning can be provided by way of cooperation. There's no need to make the same mistake twice across different countries, and thereby we could reduce the cost of learning and the risks for society that come with the technically innovation. And this brings now also the developing and the developed countries together, because the lesson of developed countries is that regulation has turned from a cost to an asset. If the regulation is proportionate and if it is well handled by capable supervisors, then regulation can be an asset and thereby even further the advancement of the financial services industry, not only in the sense that this is beneficial for intermediaries, but in particular that financial markets serve societies in which they operate by channeling monies to their most efficient means. And then add now the additional challenge of sustainability, which was raised by Dr. Hernandez in the kind of inclusive green finance or gender inclusive finance by Dr. Madlagnane. That, of course, is adding an additional layer to complexity. And here, of course, we will see how developed and developing countries together will deal with this new challenge that, of course, asks supervisors to make decisions on domains that have been previously not in the scope of their supervisory mandate. With that, I thank all the speakers for their valuable contributions, and I wish AFI and of course also the AFI European Representative Office all the success in fulfilling the missions. And I'm very looking forward to see all of you either virtually, but maybe also I prefer this physically sometimes in the next future again. Thank you very much, and thank you to all the listeners, to the watchers for their attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dirk.